Testing one, two.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to Sacred Conversations about Race and Privilege, a book study led by the clergy team of Naples United Church of Christ. This is the 5th week in an 8-week series in which we are reading How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram Kendi. Dr. Kendi is professor of history at the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. My name is David Kaiser Cross. I am joined by my colleagues, Dr. Dawson Taylor, Senior Minister, Dr. Sharon Harris Ewing, and our 4th colleague, Dr. Deb Kaiser Cross, my wife, is away for the time being helping to take care of her mother out in California. I just heard that she made it just fine, so we're all good.
So really it's about featuring Sharon in this new setup.
She's got the center seat, so.
Yeah.
Okay. As we journey through Dr. Kendi's book, we realize it hasn't been easy to obtain a copy. But as of last week, we do have a good supply in our church office. It is available for pickup or by mail by calling the church office. We also realize that a lot of this material is tough stuff. As Sharon mentioned in our 3rd week, our clergy team decided to study this book together in order to generate healthy and respectful dialogue about race and privilege in our predominantly white and privileged congregation. Well, we are not here to provide answers or to make pronouncements, but we are willing to listen, to learn, and to ask the hard questions. We do this as Christians because if we claim a gospel of love, then we must live and think in ways that promote full human freedom, dignity, and potential. But personally, I have not always lived and thought in such ways. Even now, I find myself very much aware of how my thoughts and decisions were influenced by my early upbringing and the voices of my peers. Even though I attended a middle school and a high school which had a great deal of diversity in ethnic population, it was those cliques and the jokes and the assumptions that groups had about each other that ruled our thoughts and behaviors, which of course, many of which were thoughtless and cruel. In these years, I thought I knew a lot, but I knew very little, especially about people and about myself. It was in this environment that my racism was born, and I have to say it wasn't something I learned at home. My mother, especially, was anti-racist in both her thinking and her actions. In the early 1970s, when I was a junior in high school, there was a lot of racial tension in Los Angeles and the surrounding communities that was, to a degree, reflected in our high school. I remember being surprised one morning when I was walking across the quad to see a large group of both black and white students sitting on the grass together, Bibles open on their laps. I thought it was very strange, for at that point I had not yet come into contact with Christianity as I know it now. I'm not sure that these students had much of an impact on the campus or an impact on all of the racism in our city, but the reality that an ethnically diverse group of students could sit and share spiritual insights gleaned from a book written essentially by individuals from an ancient Middle Eastern culture, well, it was kind of heartening. As I once heard, whatever population, culture, or heritage we identify with, we are spiritual beings engaging in a human experience. Unfortunately, because of racism, it is often an unequal experience. 2 Wednesdays ago, Dr. Sharon touched on the first chapters of the book. One of the most important concepts we learned is that racist is not a pejorative term. It is not a term that defines the core of a person's character. Babies are not born racist. Babies are born into racist systems. Children are not typically racist, but they are raised in racist environments where they learn assumptions about groups of people. Racism is a term that describes what someone does or says. And so in this, says Kendi, there is no neutral ground because racism has to do with power, system, and policies that tell us that there is equality when there really is not, and that there are enemies when there really are not, and when there are indisputable standards when there really are not. Last Wednesday, Deb touched upon chapters 4 through 8. These are chapters in which Kendi challenges us to consider our assumptions. For example, we assume that there are biological differences in human populations, when scientifically and genetically, we know that isn't the case. Any differences are very minuscule. We assume that our behaviors from day to day are non-offensive, when unconsciously or consciously we engage in microaggression by stereotyping individuals who cross our paths. Well, we assume that democratic and economic opportunity is available to all ethnic populations in our country, and we avoid looking at the policies of the powerful. We assume that certain races are more violent than others, or certain races are superior or inferior, and that certain cultures are better or worse. Our assumptions are often generated and propagated by the way we were raised, by books, by movies, by newspapers, and the internet, not to mention our subcultural peers. So something we forget or become lazy about, and yet something we have been taught and cautioned about by our professors, is to always question our assumptions and to always examine the holders of power. In these chapters, Kendi teaches us that racism thrives when we invite fear, ignorance, and assumptions about individuals and groups to guide our thinking, instead of focusing our attention on the wider systems and policies of power and oppression that we often accept as normal. In the next 4 chapters, chapters 9 through 12, Dr. Kendi turns the spotlight on himself and his own assumptions. In chapter 9, entitled Color, Kendi talks about assumptions in the black community, about dark and light-skinned black people, and how in the trap of dueling consciousness, he got sucked into trying to integrate with darker and poorer black people, as if to try to prove his own blackness. He tells the story about his own honey-colored contact lenses. He reveals the standards within the black community about hairstyles and eye color and skin tone. He not only talks about assumptions, but about the reality that darker-toned black persons experience greater inequality and punishment in the wider culture than lighter-toned black persons. He defines colorism as a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequities between light and dark people, supported by racist ideas about light and dark people. He says in the book, "I wanted to be black, but I did not want to look black. I had anti-racist intentions, but I was unmindful that the car of racism can drive just as far with the right intentions. And so to be anti-racist is not to reverse standards, but rather to eliminate standards based on color." So let us turn the spotlight on ourselves today and ask, what have been our own various assumptions about not just people about color, but about the various shades and styles within the white population? What judgments do we make about people when we see their skin tone, their hairstyle, or their body type? So I'll stop and we'll start there. Any ideas?
Well, I had several different kinds of thoughts. I'll express some and then let Dawson jump in. In various ways throughout the book, Kendi talks about this notion of setting standards or norms against which we judge ourselves or others, and then creating these hierarchies. In terms of the hierarchy, if you will, of colorism, I will confess I had a general awareness of that there was discrimination or prejudice along color lines, that lighter skin was favored over darker. But there were 2 aspects of this that for me were new. First, the extent to which this colorism was accepted within and therefore divided the black community. I guess I wanted to think it was just our white racism and not that it was doing the damage within the black community that it was. And then I really have to say I was appalled by the data, by the results of this colorism, and I just was naively unaware of the extent of the inequities between dark-skinned and light-skinned black people. Inequities that he says could be just as wide as those between blacks and whites. And I feel like I should have known that, but I really did not have a sense of the depth of that inequity.
Yeah, I too had awareness. I don't think it was nearly to the depth that Kendi raises. I will say I did hearken back to our conversation with President Ray and Dr. Powell Jackson on the first night of these sacred conversations. And I don't know why it struck me the way that it did, but if you remember, Bernice talked about when we asked a question about, we didn't use the term microaggression, but we asked about times that perhaps she has experienced things like that. And her immediate response was, I am lighter skinned, and so I have not experienced that, but my husband, who is much darker skinned, has. Now, I've not met her spouse that I can remember, and so if I have, I just don't have memory of that. But I've been around Bernice countless times and for many years. And so, but I was just really struck by that. And so when he started talking about that, I just thought about the fact that she was raising that up for us. I don't think in any sort of significant racist way, but really pointing out about her own experience in the greater culture, in the greater society. And so I think, like you, Sharon, I too was aware of it, but not, and this might sound odd, but the way it's applied, the applicability of that sense of racism that exists.
Yeah. Yep, yeah.
In terms of your broader question about how we respond to skin tone or other aspects of appearance, I've debated whether or not to say this. I would like to say, and it's maybe inappropriate, that I would like to think this is one set of racist ideas that I don't hold. I was a teenager in the 60s, and I remember black is beautiful.
Yeah.
And I, at the risk of being misunderstood, I genuinely find black people attractive. And to my awareness, I don't draw a color line between the lighter or the darker skinned. At the same time, I have to confess that as a teenager, I certainly, like all the other girls my age, bought into the ideal of beautifully tanned skin, which Kendi suggests is trying to replicate the color of light as a post-racial idea. Now I worry much more about skin cancer. But his comments challenge me to try to be more self-aware and to make sure that when I am interacting with people with different shades of skin, that I'm not responding in some way I'm not aware of.
Yeah, I too, as a very pale white person, have always longed for having that ability to tan. I mean, as I always joke, I have two shades, pale white and bright red. I mean, those are like my two options. And like my dad and my sister seem to be able to have the ability to get great tans, and I'm always envious. My brother and mom and I, it's like, the two shades. And, and I've always kind of wondered what that is other than the cultural implications of that, the tan body is, I think, still glorified, and living in Naples does teach you about dermatology in a different way, I think, than any place else. And actually yesterday I was having a conversation with a church member about that. But I do think, and I do wonder about, the pale white skin in a different era, the Renaissance and things, also represented a much wealthier, aristocratic look. And so I sometimes think about, when I saw this question, David, I was thinking about if that's sometimes where some of our classism and some of our classist beliefs come in. So, I can try to embrace the aristocratic idea of the pale white skin, but I still want a tan. But, I mean, it's just one of those things that I do wonder if I still believe there's some things, and if Kendi talks about this, I don't remember it, that there is that pale white skin is viewed in this very wealthy, aristocratic way.
Yeah, without belaboring it too much, I'm so aware of the way beauty is portrayed in our culture, in the way, especially in the white community. Is it dark hair? Is it blonde hair? Mm-hmm. Is it red hair? Are your eyes brown or are they blue? Are you tanned or are you pale? Mm-hmm. We have all those distinctions. The question is do we make assumptions about people and about groups of people based upon those characteristics? And I know, blonde jokes.
I was going to say, yes, people assume that blondes are ditzes.
Yeah.
Well, and so, I mean, okay, so blondes are ditzes, redheads are fiery, personalities. I mean, like I have like two nieces and a nephew with red hair, and my grandmother, her nickname was Rusty because of her red hair. And that's the understanding of redheads, is that they're fiery, and well, they're living that out. But I don't know others, but I do think we make instantaneous sizing up, shall we say, of people based on physical characteristics.
Yeah. All right, well, chapter 10, if we move on, is entitled White, which we've just been talking about. Kendi defines an anti-white racist as one who is classifying people of European descent as biologically, culturally, or behaviorally inferior, conflating the entire race of white people with racist power. I found this chapter to be, for him, very vulnerable in terms of his talking about his hatred and disillusionment with white people in general following the election time in December of 2000. He writes, "The Supreme Court discontinued Florida's recount, and white Democrats stood aside to let George Bush steal the presidency on the strength of destroyed black votes." He notes the debacle of the hanging Chad ballots in Palm Beach County and the subsequent data that revealed that 179,000 ballots in Florida were invalidated in a race that was ultimately won by 537 votes.
So I'm going to interrupt here for just a second and say that part of the vulnerability that Kendi, as you mentioned, that Kendi revealed in this chapter was actually his description of what happened to him in observing that 2000 election that made him hate white people. And for me, it was really a wonderful example of how he talks about racism happening, that we generalize from the behavior of individuals to a group, to the group to which they belong. And so in this, we say certain blacks do X, so blacks do X. In this case, he watched a group of white people make the decisions they did, call it behavior Y, and that resulted in Bush becoming president. And so he generalized from that to say, to hate white people. Now, I think there are a lot of other people who generalized from what happened, not to say that white people do Y, but to say that Republicans do Y. But I feel like I just learned from that example of how these kinds of attitudes develop, that there's a behavior, we associate that behavior beyond those individuals to a larger group. And the fact that he was willing to share that, and he wasn't defensive, it was just, that's what happened. And I mean, he wouldn't have written this book if he hadn't gotten past it, but I thought it was a really illuminating example.
Very true. And Kendi hints that for a time, he was tempted to join the Nation of Islam, where he could find a like-minded community of anger and outrage. But he says that as he learned its theology and mythology that portrayed whites, again, in general as a group, as devils, he realized that black people can be racist towards white people too. He came to this conclusion: the only thing wrong with white people is when they embrace racist ideas and policies and yet deny that their ideas and policies are racist. For Kendi, to be anti-racist is to acknowledge that there are anti-racist white people and there are racist black people, and that there is a difference between racist power and policy and those individual people. In a prelude to chapter 12, he notes that racist economic policies are geared towards enriching white male power at the expense of the average middle and lower class white male, along with the rest of the population. A particularly striking statement he makes is this: racists convince the average white person that inequity is rooted in their personal failure and is unrelated to economic policy. Well, this chapter leads us to ask some questions, but I guess The first is, have we as individuals experienced personally anti-white racism as part of our neighborhood, our community, our city? And I'll just stop there and see, do we have any experience with that? I'll speak for myself. I don't really. I can't think of a time now in junior high school, everybody hated everybody. So that was kind of across the board.
I think you had a really bad junior high
Yeah.
experience. Like, I'm just thinking about comments that you've made, although I don't think a lot of people have good junior high experiences.
Yeah,
But
right.
Anyway, go ahead, sorry.
Well, in high school, though, it was a different story.
Okay.
There were cliques. There were the jocks. There were
Yeah.
the band members. There was all the different groups and stuff. But I never really felt that white students were held in any kind of specific racial disregard by anybody else. So,
Do you feel like other ethnic groups were? Does that make sense?
yeah, it's at that point in time in high school, races were kind of dividing off.
Okay.
So we had the Black Power movement.
Okay.
We had the La Raza, and then we had a lot of Asian students.
Yeah.
And everybody had their own little idea of who was better than the other, but it never really amounted, as far as I was concerned, to out-and-out racism. So, especially in terms of everybody going to school together, everybody taking the same classes, and that kind of thing.
As I was thinking about it, I have to confess that I think it's part of my white privilege that I can't think of any instances where I've experienced anti-white racism. And I can't think of anything that would point in that direction. But what it just reminds me at a really deep level is that I have benefited from racist policies in ways that I can't identify or name. And that for me is the scary part, that things from which I have benefited are so deeply embedded that I can't name them for you. I can't point out where they are. And I was reminded when I was teaching aspiring teachers about culture, and forgive me if I've used this example before, but I talked to them about fish and fish in water. The fish live in the water, they depend on the water, they can't live outside the water, but they can't see it. And you can't see the water until you get out of it. And I feel like that's how I feel about the culture in which I live, that racist policies which support me are invisible to me, and so I need helpers who can pull me out of the water to see what's there that without help I'm not able to see it.
Right. The way I relate to that, Sharon, is that I feel a lack of microaggression. So it's what's not there that I'm becoming aware of. I can go places and I can do things, and people are not going to make assumptions about who I am because of my white privilege. So,
Yeah, I think that image or the metaphor of the fish is really powerful, so thank you for that. I too, it sounds so strange to say, but I was almost embarrassed by the fact that I couldn't come up with a time in which I have felt anti-white racism. And part of why I feel or have felt embarrassed by that was it caused me to question the diversity of the populations in which I walk. Because I don't think typically white people are racist against white people. And so part of what this reading and these conversations have continued to push me about, and you and I have talked about this some, is are the circles in which I walk diverse enough? There's some diversity, and I'm pleased about that, but are they diverse enough? And so a question like that, to me, says no. And it's not that I need to seek out people who are negative against me or racist against me. But what it says to me is I've not stepped out of my own cultural biases and cultural understandings enough, culture of origin enough to experience other things. And so I did not have those experiences, but that was kind of my follow-up thought was I haven't gone out of my comfort zone enough to experience that. I haven't been vulnerable enough as the author is with us. And so, I think that was part of what I was processing during some of those.
I just want to pick up on one aspect of this, which you mentioned, because I think this is important and goes beyond race, where he talks, I agree, the wealthy have the most to lose in terms of wealth and power by anti-racism. But this idea that we blame individuals or attribute failure to individuals, I think is a profound part of the American ethic. That we have this sense of individualism, and we talk about I'm a self-made person, and the idea that we can make our own success, or if we fail, we must have caused it, I think is part of it goes back to the frontier, and there are societies and cultures where there's a much more communitarian ethos, which says nobody makes it on their own. We all are in this together, and so I don't disagree with anything he said, but I think there's more to that particular attitude.
One of the statements he made at the end of this chapter was that what would happen if we envisioned our country, or could we envision that our country might be better off if resources and opportunities were equitably available to all groups, regardless of skin tone. And I thought, how much, I guess what I thought is how much genius are we missing in our country by segregating and keeping people powerless, when as a human being within them they have this genius to offer, but we're not taking advantage of it, from all races. So, anyway, chapter 11. All right. So at the end of chapter 10, Kendi sets the stage for this chapter by referring to the recent controversy over the Black Lives Matter movement and the countercharge that, all lives matter, or blue lives matter. In this controversy, he notes that as the average white person misinterprets the intentionality behind Black Lives Matter movement, the subsequent emotional reaction just stirs up the cauldron of hatred that actually serves to strengthen racist policy and power. So in chapter 11, which now is entitled Black, we continue Kendi's quite vulnerable discussion of black on black racism based on hierarchy and a dueling battle of consciousness between those who want to be assimilationist and those who want to be anti-racist. Some of the black on black racism was based on skin tone, some on economic level, some on criminality. But the pushback on that was the powerless defense. In other words, black people can't possibly be racist because they don't have power. Well, Kendi disassembles that idea with some observations. First, the systemic reality is that most people of color are kept from doing the work of anti-racism even in their own spheres of influence because they simply don't have the resources. That's one observation. On the other hand, says Kendi, the powerless defense underestimates the power of black people as individuals and overestimates the power of white people as individuals. And he says every person has the power to protest, to advance, or to change racist policies. Another observation is this. While white wealthy power predominates in our country, to say that black Americans who have served in Congress or black judges who hold important posts, black police officers, black professors, black CEOs, black attorneys, and the 380,000 black millionaire families in our countries to say that they have no power to strive against racist policy is disingenuous. On the other hand, he says in the past history, some black legislatures and leaders have throughout history have been a little bit complicit in racist ideas and actions, especially in the arena of law enforcement, where votes and actions have led to more mass incarceration of black men with the intention of trying to save the black community from crime and drugs. Kendi ends this chapter with a realization that today's unrest and violence and protest is not really about black people or white people, brown people, or any immigrant people. It is about racists and anti-racists. So I don't know about you as my colleagues, but when it comes to a chapter like this, I feel particularly unqualified to comment on black racism or anti-racism. But it does raise the question of white on white racism. While it may be convenient to lump whites into the European model, there are noticeable distinctions between Northern and Southern Europeans, Western and Eastern Europeans, not to mention Western Asiatic populations. There are also white-on-white distinctions in the United States between Northern and Southern, East Coast, West Coast. And so while racist power and policy may not have as great an impact on these distinctions on the white community, what assumptions do white people hold about groups within the white population?
So I was told once, actually I think I've been told more than that, that I can serve as senior minister here, being from Texas, because I don't have a Southern accent.
Who says you don't?
Right. And what's funny is actually when I was a congressional intern, they used to laugh. I hung out with the delegation from Iowa, and I used to introduce myself as part of the Texas delegation, and they used to say, "Oh, we know," you know, as soon as you open your mouth. And so, but I think it's so interesting, you know, the ways that people immediately make assumptions about people who do have Southern accents, for instance. So that's just something that I've, you know, brushed up against. But, you know, I think accents, for instance, do have quite an impact on what people presume or assume about people.
Yeah.
And that's one of the examples that I thought of. I think it's an important point, and that if we're going to look at ourselves honestly through the lens of faith in particular, we have a lot of self-examination to do, because I think there are a lot of stereotypes and generalizations that we make about different groups, whether it's based on physical appearance, on language, and I think about either regional dialects or a heavy accent because English is a second language, cultural practices, wealth, or education. Whenever we're creating a hierarchy and a model standard against which we judge other people, then we're guilty of something like racism. And I think, I remember fondly my Christian ethics professor, who was from very rural Virginia, and said, "I am literally a redneck." And he was, to look at him, but not in terms of what you assume about redneck attitudes. But I think whenever we respond to an individual as a member of a group, even if it's a group that we've constructed, like rednecks, then we're not seeing the individual or the image of God in that individual.
Right. And, you know, as I listen to you, I just have to throw in religion. You know,
Yeah.
the denominational assumptions. When somebody says, well, I'm a Baptist, or I'm a UCC, or I'm an Episcopal, we all make assumptions about, you must be, conservative, or you must be liberal, you must be this or that.
Right.
And, I think the point is for us to be aware of our assumptions in that
Well, I mean,
regard.
one of the things I love to say to you and Deb all the time, just to poke fun, is, you'll say something and I'll say, well, that's what those tree huggers from California would say,
Right.
even though, I mean nothing by it, but it's low hanging fruit. It's an easy grab. But I just think about even, I think you mentioned East Coast, West Coast, those are easy things to just kind of poke fun, because it's really not even about you or Deb. It's really about assumptions about Californians.
Right. Yeah.
But again, it's where his vulnerability and lack of defensiveness is so important, because he could leave out that chapter and not talk about black on black racism, but he's honest and straightforward, and I think we need to know about the reality of that. It also, as you did so well, challenges us to think about our own examples of where we create hierarchies and judge people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so let's go back for a second to the Black Lives Matter thing. I think it's an important topic, and we probably should touch on that, because we've got Black Lives Matter, we've got All Lives Matter. How do these two make? Are they at odds, these two statements, or what's the rational relationship between these two that transcends the emotional rhetoric surrounding these things?
I don't know if they're at odds, but increasingly, I feel like they are becoming at odds. And I have not been one in the past who has been willing to pick up the so-called mantle of Black Lives Matter, because I think I was quick to write off perhaps ill-conceived or perceived violent notions, or overly harsh political beliefs or things like that. And yet the more intentional study and reading that I've done in this time, especially since George Floyd's death, that is now a statement that I'm very comfortable making. And in part, I will be very honest to say, because of my conversation with my friend Justin, when he talked about the fact that, if, he used the context of, if you were to say, he was saying about me, if I were to say, I just don't feel like my life counts or if it matters, and Justin as a friend and as a pastor were to say to me, of course you matter, but I matter too. He said, that would just be the most awkward thing I could say to you, or one of the most awkward things. And so I feel like that's what those in the Black community must feel like when those of us, especially who are white and of privilege, say when all lives matter. I saw a meme over last weekend, over the July 4th weekend, that said all holidays matter. And again, just talking about how sometimes I think when we try to go against some of that, we can really come across slightly ridiculous, not necessarily meaning to, but it comes across in that manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I've been really grateful for my perception, at least, that more and more people are accepting the concept that Black Lives Matter, and you even see it, corporations putting out there Black Lives Matter as a positive statement. And my sense is that it was never about Black Lives Matter more than others. Mm-hmm. That the point, as I understood it, was that the experience of Black people in our country sent a message to them that their lives didn't matter. Mm-hmm. And by treating the vast inequities, the inequalities on so many fronts, and we've talked about some of them, and Kendi lays a lot of them out, to treat those as acceptable was sending the message, your lives don't matter enough for us to fix this. And so for me, it was a little bit, I was thinking again about, I think it was last week, we talked about colorblind, and the idea that saying we're not going to pay attention to race actually allows us not to look at the inequities and to have to face up to and confront the inequality. And I think the same is true if we just jump to all lives matter. We can overlook the way that some lives are lived out really differently. And whether it's health incomes or wealth incomes or education, I mean, there's just so many. And so I think it's a positive step that more and more people are able to say that comfortably.
I'm just curious, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have an image in my mind of a beach. And 100 years ago, there was a white beach and a black beach. And the whites went swimming on that beach, and the blacks went swimming on that beach, and the white beach had lifeguards, and the black beach did not. So if you went swimming and you got caught in a rip, your privilege, if you were a white person, you had the privilege of that lifeguard there ready to get out and get you. Not so much on the other side. As a result of some of the civil rights advancements, suddenly now we have beach where all colors are welcome. But when a black life gets taken out by a toe, undertow, there are way too often the lifeguard ignores that because somehow that life doesn't matter quite as much, doesn't get the attention. And I think what this whole Black Lives Matter is it doesn't matter what color you are, we're on the same beach, and if you get pulled out by an undertow, you need help. And we have a system in place to help people, and in this metaphor, it's a lifeguard, and the lifeguard is that's the job of the lifeguard, is to rescue the person who's out there, no matter what color it is. We need, when he talks about equity, I think that's the job of the lifeguard. That's the job of our society, is to create systems that are equitable for anybody who doesn't have equal access to opportunity and the same rights and privileges as everybody else. That's my image.
I think that's a powerful image.
It is.
Yeah.
And it gives me new meaning to the ideal, because he talks sometimes about an equal playing field.
Yeah.
So now my playing field's going to be the beach.
Yeah, especially,
'Cause we
5
live
blocks
here.
away, so yeah.
All right, on to chapter 12. It is entitled Class, and we've already been touching on that a little bit. But he kind of moves beyond this lower, middle, upper class economics to talk about the notion of capitalism as a systemic breeding ground for racism. He talks about the intersection of race and wealth. And a class racist he defines as one who is racializing the classes, supporting policies of racial capitalism against those race classes and justifying them by racist ideas. And he notes that this is not just a black phenomena, okay? He notes that the cultural constructs, on one hand, ghetto blacks, you got white trash on the other. They're the most obvious forms of class racism. He says when elite race classes judge the poor by their own norms, and we talked a little bit about that earlier, then the poor appear inferior. For example, he says, when we say poor people are lazy, then we are expressing elitist idea. When we say that black people are lazy, we express a racist idea. And when we say that poor black people are lazy, it is class racism. So I thought that was is very insightful. Kendi reviews in this chapter the history of modern capitalism through the lens and the history of transatlantic slave trade. And he applauds the ideal of capitalism that in the sense that free markets can benefit all when everybody's on a level playing field, but that doesn't really represent the reality of a system that benefits the few at the expense of enslaved peoples, environmental exploitation, and racist policies. He talks about the ideal of the capitalist system and the realities of the capitalist system, and suggests that while it's based on free enterprise, there are aspects that promote enslavement rather than freedom. And as I was thinking about that, I was trying to say, what would those be? And as I think about our country's history and the different regions of our country, I think about the coal mines. I think about garment factories. I think about human trafficking. All of these things benefit the wealthy and basically enslave those who are in those systems. So I want to kind of try to wrap up our time today with a couple of questions. First of all, do you have any comments about that chapter 12, the class capitalism, class idea that he talks about?
I just have one quick comment about what you were just talking about, particularly about the coal mining. I just keep thinking about how much that comes back in our current political climate and political dialogue. I don't think I disagree with what you're saying about how that plays itself out. And yet, I would tell you that one of the things that gets brought up is in an industry that's, I wouldn't say dead, but dying, an active death, that part of what gets promised by political leaders, really at all levels, is this, I can or we can bring back the coal industry. I mean, coal, once it's gone, it's gone. And so I agree, it makes rich people richer or to have access to things that they want on the backs of those who mine it. But I'm also amazed at how those who mine it want it to still be available. And yes, it's a lifestyle, the job market, I get it. But it's also, we have taken that dialogue and just placed it in a box that, and it's captured in this loop of there is no other way. And so I just was struck by that when we talk about class. And I don't think coal mining is the only thing like that. It just seems like it gets on the forefront, especially in election years.
Right.
And when you mentioned some of those things, immediately what popped to my mind was also migrant farming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And thinking about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and I don't know the number of years back, but basically some of the work that they did to improve working conditions used terms like being enslaved because of the conditions, and they've made a tremendous difference, but certainly that would be another example.
Sure.
Yeah. And still are today in some of their work, which I think is important to remind us. And part of their focus currently, you mentioned this as well, is sex trafficking and the abuse of women in the fields, and that's been something they've opened. I believe our collective eyes. I know mine, but I think we've talked about this as a team,
Sure.
as well. So anyway, that's totally not your question. Sorry, but
No, that's quite all right. So, what are we've been doing this together for a little while. What are one or two ideas that Kendi has put forth in these first 12 chapters that you have either found to be the most disconcerting or the most encouraging?
I think the most disconcerting for me is the history of racist ideas and racist actions. I mean, his descriptions of the beginning of the slave trade out of Portugal, and the notion that blacks are the ones who should be slaves when there had always been slaves, but this, just the depth and breadth of the information that he provides is overwhelming. It's not what we learned in school.
Right. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah, I think kind of continuing on what Sharon was saying about the disconcerting part, I think in his vulnerability, where he talks about the amount of violence that he has seen and experienced, and he says this in a relatively sheltered existence, is pretty disconcerting. I just was really struck by his so far his stories of Smur, his friend on the well, I don't know that friend is the right word, but
Peer.
Peer acquaintance, and I was just really struck by his recounting some of those tales. I'm deeply encouraged by where he talks about right at the outset about how the term racist doesn't, and you encapsulated it well, I'm not going to remember it correctly, but it doesn't have to be a defining phrase. You know, it doesn't have to define who we are. It can define some of our actions that we're not proud of, but actions can be changed. You know, it doesn't have to define who we are at our core. And I would just say that just by having these conversations and reading this book, my eyes are opened to my actions and my responses to things, and to policies that are in place, both in our policies here at the church and as a denomination, and just re-examining things that
Sure.
I think need to be re-examined.
Yeah. All right. Any other comments on that one? No? Okay. So my last question is, I think about some of the things that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount and some of his parables and that kind of thing. Is there anything in this book that can widen our spiritual perspective so that it might benefit the life of our community of faith, this church, in the months and years ahead? I think being able to do this, for me, is an act of hope that our entire community, as much as it is difficult to engage with these ideas and to examine ourselves and our assumptions, that it will make us better people. It'll make us more tolerant, and it'll make us more aware of how we deal with people in our community of all colors. And so I think if a study like this continues to make us more open in that regard, I think we're heading in the right direction. So.
As I think I said at the very beginning, I see these sacred conversations as an opportunity to learn, and specifically to learn from people whose stories we don't usually hear. Mm-hmm. And for me, you're talking about the Sermon on the Mount or many aspects of Jesus' ministry where the people he went to were the downtrodden, the vulnerable, the people who were not at the top of the hierarchy, but at the bottom. And so the opportunity to learn from people who are more vulnerable, who have been outcast, whose lives have been more difficult because of racist policies. And I think one of the ways is reading this book and hearing from Kendi himself. Another is by talking to people we know and listening. And I'm happy to say that 3 weeks from tonight, on the last of this series, we will have 3 people who will form a panel. Vincent Keys is president of the NAACP of Collier County and will be with us via Zoom. And also an interracial couple who live most of the year here in Naples and have been very active in the community and in all kinds of work. Actually recently learned that they spent 5 years living in Ghana. I'm excited because they will be here to tell us some of their stories and hopefully to give us some ideas about how we can move forward. So if you get our emails, you got a message today that the Justice Committee that is sponsoring that last event, it welcomes questions, and you can send your questions for those panelists to justice@naplesucc.org. We're looking forward to a really good conversation to, I don't want to say wrap up and close all this, but this chapter of it and help us to figure out what comes next.
Great.
Yeah. When we think about this in the context of Jesus' work and of the Gospels, I just think about that phrase where Jesus, when asked about what we are to do in response to miracles or in response to a teaching, where Jesus says, go and do likewise. Because I think sometimes it's easy to read a book like How to Be an Antiracist, or a book, the book of, I think, Austin Channing Brown that wrote on, the book on white fragility that many people are reading, and things about, it's easy to get really overwhelmed and to think, okay, well, I mean, we joke about like, oh, it's time to go do clergy roundtable and solve racism, as if, the 3 of us as white people of privilege sitting here can do that. But it can just be so overwhelming. But I just think about the idea of go and do likewise, meaning go and be vulnerable like Dr. Kendi, and go and be self-reflective, and go and question why things are the way they are, and what are we privileged to benefit by and to receive by. And so I think those are such important questions and such important things to ask ourselves. And so I think that's where I find my faith rooted, in these stories and in these conversations. And again, this, as Sharon was saying, just the continual learning and dialogue that the book prompts, but then hopefully that flows over to life.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We're glad you are with us, and we invite you to come back next week. We'll be looking at a few more chapters. Dawson, will you be leading next week?
Yes, I'm on next week, and I think it's
13
to 15.
13 to 15.
13 to 15, right? And once again, remember, we do have books available in the church office, and they're available to you, and we can either send them to you or you can drop by and pick them up. So thanks for joining us tonight, and let's just close with a word of prayer. We do thank you, Lord, for the privilege of being able to be here, to be a church, and to learn, and to become more sensitive to your will for our lives. So bless us and keep us, and surround us with your love and grace as we move forward in the days ahead. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.